Hey everyone, this is eTeacher Tech, how strategic planning works. Teacher Anna at your service. Welcome to eTeacher Tech. A blessed day to everyone. I hope you are doing fine today. What comes into your mind when you hear the word strategic planning? Alright, I am sure that there are so many words that you might think or relate when you hear this term. For today's topic, I want to share with you on how strategic planning works, its origin and history, the concept and characteristics of strategic planning, as well as the strategic planning process, and final remarks and a little reminders at the end. So are you ready? Alright, so let's begin. Now, let's discover the origin and history of strategic planning. The military origin. From its military roots, strategic planning has kept at least two essential characteristics. These are the following. First is to think big by taking into consideration all possible options and paying due attention to the changing environment, and to focus on a clear, final, and firm long-term goal to be achieved. Okay, so that is the military origin of strategic planning. How about the adoption in the business world? There are two interrelated important evolutions happened. First, it was gradually realized that, at least in complex enterprises, strategic planning should not only take place at the executive level, but that it should also be undertaken at the different levels and functions within the organization. Every manager is a strategy maker and strategy implementer for the area which he or she has authority over and supervises. Second, it also became clear that in order to increase the chances of successful implementation, the preparation of a strategic plan could not be left to external consultants or even internal planning units alone, unless those in charge of implementation identify with what is being proposed. Plans tend to become paper exercises. A good plan will take into consideration the whole organization or management unit, and therefore all staff should be involved in its preparation in one way or another. Now here comes the transfer of strategic planning to the public sector. Strategic planning entered the public and semi-public sectors during the mid-1980s. The basic assumption behind the introduction of strategic management in the government sector is that, in spite of their differences, strategic planning is an approach which is relevant to all kinds of organizations simply because all organizations have specific long-term goals to reach, and since resources are always limited, they have to find the most efficient way to attain this. Now, you might ask, what is the use of strategic planning in the education sector based on history? Strategic planning in the education sector emerged in the US as early as the late 1970s, but mainly at the institutional, university and college level. In the mid-1980s, an estimated 500 districts were practicing some form of strategic planning, and special handbooks were prepared and widely disseminated by professional organizations such as the American Association of School Administrators. Strategic planning at the school level was also introduced in many other countries, as part of the broader decentralization and school-based management reforms of the late 1980s. Strategic planning at the central education system level did not take off before the 1990s. In 1988, the disappointment with traditional planning methods was much discussed. The practice of preparing strategic education sector plans was adopted several years later and was, at least in developing countries, intimately linked to the gradual introduction of sector-wide approaches in development cooperation from the mid-1990s onward. By endorsing the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness in 2005, aid recipient countries committed themselves to exercise leadership in preparing and implementing national development strategies and to translate these national development strategies into results-oriented plans and programs. So, that is the origin and history of strategic planning. I hope you learned something based on that history. Now, I am going to share to you the concept and characteristics of strategic planning. Let's take a look at the traditional planning. Based on the traditional development planning, planning is nothing exceptional. Why? Human beings have been planning in one way or another since rational thinking emerged. However, as a formalized way of organizing development in complex societies, planning is an invention of the 20th century. The preparation of directive development plans has been the backbone of socialist states since the Communist Revolution of 1970. Contrary to the socialist directive planning, indicative planning accepts the primacy of the private market economy, but it tries to guide investments towards national priority objectives, avoid duplication of efforts, and, to the extent possible, reduce cyclical instability. The same two types of planning, which are the indicative or directive, were also applied in the education sector. Over time, various forecasting techniques and simulation models were developed which aim at orienting the educational investments either according to the needs of the labor market, which is the manpower approach, or to the social demand for education, the social demand approach, or to the needs of education subsectors with the best rate of return, the cost-benefit approach, or to a more or less harmonious combination of these three approaches. At the beginning of the 1960s, educational planning was seen as a must for the newly independent countries in order to allow them to move ahead quickly and systematically with their human resource development. However, in many instances, the results did not correspond to the expectations, and this enchantment with the classical planning approach, which had started already in the 1970s, became more vigorous in the 1980s. Now, here are the main criticisms with regards to traditional planning. First, too much focus was placed on plan preparation and not enough on implementation. Second, plans were being prepared in a top-down, technocratic way. Third is, not enough consideration was given to the changing environment. Now, let's proceed to the key characteristics of strategic planning, which is supposed to remedy the above-mentioned shortcomings. The first key characteristic of strategic planning is guided by an overall sense of direction. Here comes the mission statement. What does a mission statement summarizes? These are the following. First, overall goal, which the organization is trying to accomplish. Second, main method it is going to follow to reach its goal. Third, basic principles and values that will guide the fulfillment of the mission. Another important thing that should be considered on the first key characteristic of strategic planning is the vision statement. What is a vision statement? So it sets out the ideal state of affairs which the organization would like eventually to achieve. The second key characteristic is strategic planning is sensitive to the environment. So this states that the successful development of an organization is the result of finding the right fit between its internal strengths and weaknesses and the external opportunities and threats stemming from the environment. Next key characteristic would be strategic planning is result-oriented. Alright, so the main emphasis is performance or results monitoring. Results of a specific activity are then usually measured at 3 successive levels, which are first, immediate outputs, example, the number of schools built. Then second, the intermediate outcomes, example would be the increased enrollment rates. Then the third one is the long-term impacts, example would be the increased average number of years of schooling of the population. Alright, so in order to be able to measure properly the different types of results obtained, the overall broad policy goals will have to be translated into more precise objectives or expected results that must be reached during the medium-term plan. Then those objectives will have to be made measurable, or what we call SMART, which means it is specific, measurable, agreed upon, realistic, and timely. Another key characteristic of strategic planning would be it serves as a mobilization instrument. How? Strategic planning cannot succeed without the commitment of the plan implementers and the different stakeholders. Commitment can only be obtained if people identify with the plan so that they are motivated to produce the expected results. Strategic planning should therefore not be carried out in isolation by experts alone, but rather as an inclusive process in which the implementers and stakeholders are actively involved in one way or another. Strategic planning is flexible in its implementation. An essential characteristic of strategic planning is, therefore, to proceed by intelligent trial and error rather than by linear adherence to a detailed, polished plan document. The importance of flexible implementation for successful strategic planning cannot be overestimated, but flexible does not mean unsystematic. Indeed, the only solid basis for a flexible plan implementation process is a rigorous monitoring system, which provides the necessary information for analyzing where the constraints and possibilities are and for adapting the original proposals. So, those are the different key characteristics of strategic planning. I hope it might help you in making your own decisions. Now, I am going to present to you the differences between traditional and strategic planning. The table shows the differences between traditional and strategic planning, where in traditional planning, it is stated there that it is input-oriented, technocratic, neutral, linear planning, rigid implementation, routine-based, compliance monitoring, emphasis on the plan document. While on strategic planning, it is result-oriented, participatory, mobilization instrument, iterative planning, flexible implementation, change-oriented, performance monitoring, and emphasis on plan implementation. Okay, so that is the summary of differences between the traditional and strategic planning. Alright, so after I presented to you the origin and history, the concept and characteristics of strategic planning, I hope you learned something from it. Okay, so now let's proceed to the strategic planning process. Here comes the questions and activities. So strategic planning is basically about systematically answering 4 key questions, and each question corresponds to a set of specific planning activities. Okay, so here are the questions and activities that we have to consider in strategic planning. So the questions are, first, where do we stand today? So the planning activity would be the diagnosis, wherein this includes analyzing the current situation in the sector and its environment. Another question is, where would we like to be in the future? So the planning activity would be the policy formulation. That includes selecting overall goals and strategies. Next would be, how shall we get there? Alright, so the planning activity would be the plan preparation, which defines the precise objectives and balancing objectives and means. And the last question would be, how shall we know we are moving in the right direction? Alright, so the planning activity would be monitoring, and that includes measuring progress and taking corrective action. So those are the questions and activities that we have to follow. Now, let's talk about diagnosis. In diagnosis, it is important to bear in mind that from a strategic planning point of view, the sector analysis should not be limited in scope to the education system as such, but should also cover the environment in which the system is operating. Of particular importance in this respect are the analysis of demographic trends, the economic system, and in particular, the labor market, the financial situation, and also the socio-cultural context, which includes the language diversity and minority issues. Next is the policy formulation. Policy formulation has to do with defining long-term goals, which might well extend beyond the medium-term plan, and with selecting major strategies to reach these goals. Policy formulation is therefore not a straightforward technical exercise, but rather a complex process, which should start with a review of existing policies and which further implies intensive interaction between the planning experts and the political decision makers for designing the new policy. Next Next on the policy formulation is the plan preparation, which is the medium-term strategic plan. The first planning task is to prepare a medium-term strategic sector plan. So this basically consists of carrying out the following activities. First is translating long-term policy goals into specific measurable objectives and targets to be achieved within a given time period. Second, designing systematic priority action programs for reaching the objectives with indication of the key activities to be completed, the corresponding timelines, and the units responsible for each activity. And the last one would be estimating the resources, such as human, physical, and financial, needed to carry out the plan, calculating the corresponding costs, and balancing this with the available resources. Next process is the preparation of annual operation plans. What includes in the preparation of annual operational plans? Okay, so an annual operational plan is a practical work plan which spells out in detail the activities to be undertaken during the year in order to progress as effectively as possible towards achieving the goals and objectives of the medium-term plan. It is a brief technical instrument without much text to be used for guiding the medium-term plan implementation on a yearly basis. So it is normally follows the same structure and the same logical framework format as the program matrices of the medium-term plan, but it is more detailed and precise. Okay, so after preparing the annual operational plans, here comes the monitoring. Monitoring is the internal management process by which systematic information about plan implementation is gathered and analyzed with a view to identifying strengths and weaknesses and formulating practical proposals for taking the necessary action in order to reach the planned results. Monitoring is mainly done by using the different types of indicators chosen for measuring progress and reaching the objectives and targets as indicated in the medium-term and annual operational plans. So the information thus collected is then analyzed and the results presented in the form of progress reports, also called review or performance reports, which are produced at regular intervals to serve as a basis for collective reviewing. That is, for collectively analyzing and discussing a performance report and for making appropriate decisions about any follow-up action to be taken. Alright, so those are the strategic planning process. With that information, I hope and I am expecting you that you will be having a well-organized and systematic plan in the future. Okay, so we'll now come to the final remarks and a little reminders. All of you should be reminded of the following. First, there is no single way of preparing a strategic plan. Second, the first benefit of strategic planning is the process and not the plan document. Next is, there is no such thing as perfect plan. And next would be, the most difficult part of strategic planning is not technical, but human. And the last one would be, strategic planning should permeate all levels of the education system. Again, this is Teacher Anna and you're watching eTeacher Tech. Thank you and God bless you all.